Georgism is an economic philosophy holding that the economic value derived from land, including natural resources and natural opportunities, should belong equally to all residents of a community, but that people own the value that they create themselves. The Georgist paradigm offers solutions to social and ecological problems, relying on principles of land rights and public finance which attempt to integrate economic efficiency with social justice. Georgism is concerned with the distribution of economic rent caused by natural monopolies, pollution, and the control of commons, including title over natural resources and other contrived privileges. Any natural resource, which is inherently limited in supply, can generate economic rent. But the classical and most significant example of land monopoly involves the extraction of common ground rent from valuable urban locations. Georgists argue that taxing economic rent is efficient, fair, and equitable. The main Georgist policy tool is a tax assessed on land value. Georgists argue that revenues from a land value tax can reduce or eliminate existing taxes on labor and investment that are unfair and inefficient. Some Georgists also advocate for the return of surplus public revenue back to the people through a basic income or citizens' dividend. Economists since Adam Smith have observed that, unlike other taxes, a public levy on land value does not cause economic inefficiency. A land value tax is often said to have progressive tax effects, in that it is paid primarily by the wealthy, and it cannot be passed on to tenants, workers, or users of land. Land value capture would reduce economic inequality, increase wages, remove incentives to misuse real estate, and reduce the vulnerability that economies face from credit and property bubbles. The philosophical basis of Georgism dates back to several early proponents such as John Locke, Baruch Spinoza, and Thomas Paine. But the concept of gaining public revenues from natural resource privileges was widely popularized by the economist and social reformer Henry George, and his first book, Progress and Poverty, published in 1879. Georgist ideas were popular and influential in the late 19th and early 20th century. Political parties, institutions and communities were founded based on Georgist principles during that time. Early followers of Henry George's economic philosophy called themselves single taxes, associated with the idea of raising public revenue exclusively from land and privileges. But the term is now considered a misnomer because Georgists usually support multiple mechanisms for government funding. In classical and Georgist economics, the term land is defined as all locations, natural opportunities, resources, physical forces, and government privileges over economic domains, which is closely related to the concept of commons. Georgism was coined later, and some prefer the term geoism or geonomics to distinguish their beliefs from those of Henry George. Main tenets. Many people have observed that privately created wealth is socialized via the tax system, while socially created wealth in land values are privatized in the price of land titles and bank mortgages. The opposite would be the case if land rent replaced taxes on labor as the main source of public revenue. Socially created wealth would become available for use by the community, while the fruits of labor would remain private. Henry George is best known for popularizing these classical arguments in favor of effecting this reform in land title and tax policy. In Progress and Poverty, George argues that people justly own what they create, but that natural opportunities and land belong equally in common to all. George believed there was an important distinction between common and collective property. Although equal rights to land might be achieved by nationalizing land and then leasing it to private users, George preferred taxing unimproved land value and leaving the control of land mostly in private hands. George's reasoning for leaving land in private control and slowly shifting to land value tax was that it would not penalize existing owners who had improved land and would also be less disruptive and controversial in a country where land titles have already been granted. George believed that although scientific experiments could not be carried out in political economy Theories could be tested by comparing different societies with different conditions and through thought experiments about the effects of various factors. Applying this method, George concluded that many of the problems that beset society, such as poverty, inequality, and economic booms and busts, could be attributed to the private ownership of the necessary resource, land. In Georgism, a land value tax is seen as fitting the definition of a user fee instead of a tax, since it is tied to the market value of socially created locational advantage, the privilege to exclude others from locations. Assets consisting of commodified privilege can be viewed as wealth since they have exchange value, similar to taxi medallions. A land value tax, charging fees for exclusive use of land, as a means of raising public revenue, is also a progressive tax tending to reduce economic inequality, since it falls entirely on ownership of valuable land, which is highly correlated to incomes, and there is no means by which landlords can shift the tax burden onto tenants or laborers. Economic properties. Standard economic theory suggests that a land value tax would be extremely efficient. Unlike other taxes, it does not reduce economic productivity. Nobel laureate Milton Friedman described Henry George's tax on unimproved value of land as the least bad tax, since unlike other taxes, it would not impose an excess burden on economic activity. Hence, a replacement of other more distortionary taxes with a land value tax would improve economic welfare, as land value tax can improve the use of land and redirect investment toward productive, non-rent-seeking activities. It could even have a negative deadweight loss that boosts productivity, because land value tax would fall on foreign land speculators. The Australian Treasury estimated that land value tax was unique in having a negative marginal excess burden, meaning that it would increase long-run living standards. It was Adam Smith who first noted the efficiency and distributional properties of a land value tax in his book, The Wealth of Nations. Ground rents are a still more proper subject of taxation than the rent of houses. A tax upon ground rents would not raise the rents of houses. It would fall altogether upon the owner of the ground rent, who acts always as a monopolist, and exacts the greatest rent which can be got for the use of his ground. More or less can be got for it according as the competitors happen to be richer or poorer, or can afford to gratify their fancy for a particular spot of ground at a greater or smaller expense. In every country the greatest number of rich competitors is in the capital, and it is there accordingly that the highest ground rents are always to be found, as the wealth of those competitors would in no respect be increased by a tax upon ground rents. They would not probably be disposed to pay more for the use of the ground. Whether the tax was to be advanced by the inhabitant, or by the owner of the ground, would be of little importance. The more the inhabitant was obliged to pay for the tax, the less he would incline to pay for the ground, so that the final payment of the tax would fall altogether upon the owner of the ground rent. Both ground rents and the ordinary rent of land are a species of revenue which the owner, in many cases, enjoys without any care or attention of his own, though a part of this revenue should be taken from him in order to defray the expenses of the state. No discouragement will thereby be given to any sort of industry. The annual produce of the land and labor of the society, the real wealth and revenue of the great body of the people, might be the same after such a tax as before. Ground rents and the ordinary rent of land are, therefore, perhaps, the species of revenue which can best bear to have a peculiar tax imposed upon them. Nothing can be more reasonable than that a fund which owes its existence to the good government of the state should be taxed peculiarly, or should contribute something more than the greater part of other funds, towards the support of that government. Ben Franklin and Winston Churchill made similar distributional and efficient arguments for publicly capturing land rents. They noted that the costs of taxes and the benefits of public spending always eventually fall on and enrich respectively the owners of land. Therefore, they believed it would be best to defray public costs and recapture value of public spending by placing public charges directly on owners of land titles, rather than harming public welfare with taxes on trade and labor. Henry George wrote that his plan would call upon people to contribute to the public not in proportion to what they produce, but in proportion to the value of natural, common, opportunities that they hold, monopolize. He went on to explain that by taking for public use that value which attaches to land by reason of the growth and improvement of the community, it would make the holding of land unprofitable to the mere owner, and profitable only to the user. Under George's plan, it would be impossible for speculators to hold valuable natural opportunities like urban real estate unused or only partly used. George claimed this would have many benefits, including the reduction or removal of tax burdens from poorer neighborhoods and agricultural districts, the removal of a multiplicity of taxes and expensive obsolete government institutions, the elimination of corruption, fraud, and evasion in the collection of taxes, the enablement of true free trade, the destruction of monopolies, the elevation of wages to the full value of labor, the transformation of labor-saving inventions into blessings for all, and the equitable distribution of comfort, leisure, and other advantages that are made possible by an advancing civilization. Sources of economic rent and related policy interventions: income flow resulting from payments for restricted access to natural opportunities or for contrived privileges over geographic regions is called economic rent. Georgists argue that economic rent of land, legal privileges, and natural monopolies should accrue to the community, rather than private owners. In economics, land is everything that exists in nature independent of human activity. While the philosophy of Georgism does not say anything definitive about specific policy interventions needed to address problems posed by various sources of economic rent, the common goal among modern Georgists is to capture and share rent from all sources of natural monopoly and legal privilege. Henry George shared the goal of modern Georgists to socialize or dismantle rent from all forms of land monopoly and legal privilege. However, George focused mainly on his preferred policy tool known as land value tax, which targeted a particular form of unearned income called ground rent. George focused on ground rent because basic locations were more valuable than other monopolies and everybody needed locations to survive, which he contrasted with the less significant streetcar and telegraph monopolies, which George also spoke out against. George likened the problem to a laborer traveling home who is waylaid by a series of highway robbers along the way, each who demand a small portion of the traveler's wages. And finally at the very end of the road waits a robber who demands all that the traveler has left. George reasoned that it made little difference to challenge the series of small robbers when the final robber remained to demand all that the common laborer had left. George predicted that over time technological advancements would increase the frequency and importance of lesser monopolies, yet he expected that ground rent would remain dominant. George even predicted that ground rents would rise faster than wages and income to capital, a prediction that modern analysis has shown to be plausible, since the supply of land is fixed. Common ground rent is still the primary focus of Georgists because of its large value and the known diseconomies of misused land. However, there are other sources of rent that are theoretically analogous to ground rent and are highly debated topics within Georgism. The following are some sources of economic rent: extractable resources, severables, extraterrestrial domains, legal privileges tied to location, restrictions, taxes on pollution or severance, right-of-way used by railroads, utilities, and internet service providers, issuance of legal tender, privileges that are less location-dependent but that still exclude others from natural opportunities, where free competition is impossible, such as telegraphs, water, gas, and transportation. George wrote, business becomes a proper social function, which should be controlled and managed by and for the whole people concerned. Georgists were divided by this question of natural monopolies and often favored public ownership only of the rents from common rights of way, rather than public ownership of utility companies themselves. Georgism and environmental economics. The early conservationist movement of the Progressive era was inspired by Henri George, and his influence extended for decades afterward. Some ecological economists still support the Georgist policy of land value tax as a means of freeing or rewilding unused land and conserving nature. By reducing urban sprawl, pollution degrades the value of what Georgists consider to be commons. Because pollution is a negative contribution, it taking from the commons or a cost imposed on others, its value is economic rent, even when the polluter is not receiving an explicit income. Therefore, to the extent that society determines pollution to be harmful, most Georgists propose to limit pollution and then capture the resulting rents for public use, restoration, or a citizen's dividend. Georgism is related to the school of ecological economics, since both propose market-based restrictions on pollution. The schools are compatible in that they advocate using similar tools as part of a conservation strategy, but they emphasize different aspects. Conservation is the central issue of ecology, whereas economic rent is the central issue of geoism. Ecological economists might price pollution fines more conservatively to prevent inherently unquantifiable damage to the environment, whereas Georgists might emphasize mediation between conflicting interests and human rights. Geolibertarianism, a market-oriented branch of geoism, tends to take a direct stance against what it perceives as burdensome regulation and would like to see auctioned pollution quotas or taxes replace most command and control regulation. Since ecologists are primarily concerned with conservation, they tend to put less emphasis on the issue of equitably distributing scarcity, pollution rents, whereas Georgists insist that unearned income not be captured by those who hold title to natural assets and pollution privilege. To the extent that geoists recognize the impact of pollution or share conservationist values, they will agree with ecological economists about the need to limit pollution. But geoists will also crucially insist that pollution rents generated from those conservation efforts are not captured by polluters and are instead used for public purposes or to compensate those who suffer the negative effects of pollution. Ecological economists advocate similar pollution restrictions, but, placing conservation first, might be willing to grant private polluters the privilege to capture pollution rents. To the extent that ecological economists share the geoist view of social justice, they would advocate auctioning pollution quotas instead of giving them away for free. This distinction can be seen clearly in the difference between basic cap and trade and the geoist variation, cap and share. A proposal to auction temporary pollution permits, with rents going to the public, instead of giving pollution privilege away for free to existing polluters or selling perpetual permits. Revenue uses. The revenue can allow the reduction or elimination of taxes, greater public investment, spending, or the direct distributed of funds to citizens as a pension or basic income, citizens' dividend. In practice, the elimination of all other taxes implies a very high land value tax, higher than any currently existing land tax. Introducing a high land value tax that is greater than the value of existing taxes would cause the price of land titles to eventually decrease. George did not believe landowners should be compensated, and described the issue as being analogous to compensation for former slave owners. Other geoists disagree on the question of compensation. Some advocate complete compensation while others support only enough compensation required to achieve Georgist reforms. Geoists have also long differed from Georgists to the degree of rent capture needed. Historically, those who advocated for public rent capture only high enough to replace other taxes were known as supporters of single tax limited